Apart from the fundamental pieces of equipment like your mask, fins and snorkel, there is a golden trio, 3 pieces of dive equipment that basically every scuba diver needs. So the first is your regulator, because that's what you breathe from, so that's pretty important. Your BCD, which kind of holds you and most of your gear together and helps you control your buoyancy in the water. That's fairly important too. But without the third piece of equipment, we would be stuck in an underwater world of tables and calculations, trying to work out when and if it's safe to ascend based on your wristwatch and a depth gauge. This is where your dive computer steps in and does all of that complicated calculations for you so that you can dive safer. Your dive computer may seem like a very unassuming piece of kit, but it is doing a lot of complicated stuff on the inside, even when you've left the water. Despite all of its intricacy and its power inside, most scuba divers will only look at the big number at the top of the screen and kind of glance at the number in the middle when it comes to ascend or to do your safety stop. If their dive computer starts flashing or showing one of the many 3-letter acronyms, or TLAs, they'll just look at the screen kind of wide-eyed, hoping that it will just go away and just go back to the normal counting down of their safety stop. Now, I do understand that dive computers are fairly complicated and they can throw a lot of information at you, but this is why it's important that you read your computer manual. Ew, I know, reading your computer manual is probably some awful bedtime reading and it will put Junior down in record time, but it is important that when a symbol pops up or a TLA kind of shows its face on the screen, that you understand what your computer is trying to tell you. This is why you need to be one with your dive computer. Dive computers, especially segment display computers, can display quite a lot of information, but there is only a finite amount of space on the screen to spell things out for you. Modern LED and LCD screens are great because they can display more complicated information, but they don't have unlimited space to spell everything out for you. Segmented displays are even worse. The best case scenario is that they have a dedicated symbol or picture so that you know what you have to do, that you have to do a stop at a certain depth. But worst case is that you have to work out which letters it's trying to spell out. I mean, is that a V or is it a U? Maybe it's a 5, or maybe this is an S. Who knows? And then you have to work out what that TLA actually stands for before you can act on the information. And if you haven't read the manual, it's showing a number 3 next to it. Is 3 a good number? Is 3 a lot? Is 3 not enough? Who knows? Who knows?
It's the magic number.
3?
It's the magic number.
By spending some time with your dive computer and the manual, you can learn what it's trying to tell you at different times of the dive. So that symbol means you're sealing, so I can't go above that depth when I see that. And the aeroplane means that I can't get on an aeroplane yet. And AC means it's just in contact with water, not that the computer's too hot and it wants you to turn the AC on. If you don't understand what your dive computer is telling you, then you can get flustered in the water and you can end up doing the wrong thing. My first ever dive computer had a mode on it called gauge mode, among many others obviously. Now, I knew what scuba mode meant and what apnea and nitrox mode meant, but I didn't really know what gauge mode was, so I took it on a diving gauge mode. It looked a little bit different from normal, but the depth kind of changed as I went up and down, which seemed correct. But it wasn't until later on, when I tried to change out of gauge mode, that I got a little bit worried. Without thinking, I had unwittingly changed the settings on my dive computer, which had some serious consequences. By diving the computer in gauge mode, this locks the dive computer into basically only dive in gauge mode for 48 hours. Gauge mode doesn't record your tissue loading because it assumes that another dive computer is doing all of that for you, and you basically just want it to act as a depth gauge and a bottom timer as just a redundant backup. If you want to switch back to normal scuba mode, it doesn't know where to start because it doesn't know all of the information about your last dive, so it plays it safe and just stops you from using it to dive in any other mode until your tissues have cleared. Most dive computers will allow you a certain level of fiddling around in the settings, and it's obviously important that you know what you're changing and what you're changing them to. Dive computers, especially recreational computers, can be strapped to pretty much anybody's wrist, and we're all different, so our decompression will all be different too, so we all need to tell our dive computers so that they're a bit more tailored to each and every one of us. There's no point in setting your dive computer so that you can stay down longer if you're, let's be honest, less than fit and healthy. Your dive computer doesn't really care if you lie to it, but you'll be the one that ends up paying for it. Much like your partner, lying to them only makes things worse for you. On some dive computers, you can even change your dive profile and how your dive computer works out your stops by fiddling around with the GF or your gradient factors. By changing your computer's gradient factors without fully understanding what those two numbers mean can be super dangerous. By turning off alarms as well and setting your max PPO2 to the maximum, then sure, you're going to be able to dive a little bit deeper without the annoying beeping from starting, but again, the alarms are there to keep you safe. If you truly know your dive computer's setting and how your body works with decompression, then sure, you can start fiddling around with the settings. There are many stories of divers who try to fool their dive computer or ask for ways to get around certain blocks, but these stories all have one thing in common: divers who don't fully understand what their dive computer is for. Your dive computer has one job in life, and that is to get you back to the surface safely. If it could, it would probably stop you from going underwater completely, because at least it's safe at sea level, you're safe from decompression. Stories of scuba divers lowering their dive computer on a piece of string to given depths so that the dive computer thinks that they're actually doing a proper stop at depth and, decompression properly, basically to try and kind of avoid locking you out completely, or to, just save themselves some boredom on a safety stop, is just begging for some time in a chamber. If you miss a stop or if you ascend too fast, then just kind of fess up, take your surface interval as punishment, and just stay out of the chamber. Again, your dive computer doesn't really care. The same thing goes for diving with two dive computers. What's the point in swapping between two different dive computers because one has locked you out? The other one is under the assumption that you haven't been diving for days, so it doesn't know about your gases loaded into your tissues. The first one does, and that's why it locked you out. And another one that always gets me is just people asking how to reset their dive computer, or they're confused when it locks them out of a certain dive mode, or just diving completely. Stop trying to bypass safety features on dive computers. They're there to keep you out of the chamber, or worse. As complicated as your dive computer is, it is basically made up of three simple things: a stopwatch, a pressure sensor, and an algorithm. Everything else is just a bonus. By knowing how deep you are and how long you've been there, the algorithm basically works out roughly how much absorbed gas is in your fast and slow tissues. You only really learn about three gases when it comes to decompression and scuba diving in general, and which one you kind of know about kind of determines your level of scuba diver. The first gas that you learn about is nitrogen, and this is what all dive computers will be focused on straight out of the box. Nitrogen is the gas that causes most of the problems with decompression because it's the largest part of the gas that we breathe. The algorithm that is inside your dive computer has been through many revisions and basically works out how much gas is absorbed into all of your different bodily tissues, from your skin and your muscles to your bones. And it's working out all of this on the go as you go up and down on your dive. Many algorithms today work on a 16 tissue kind of sort of formula, so you'll often see them named something like ZHL16C, and they continue to work outside of the water too, working out how quickly each tissue gets rid of this excess nitrogen on the surface. As you start to go deeper, you learn about oxygen and nitrogen mixes. Straight out of the box, your dive computer thinks that you'll be breathing air, or more specifically 21% oxygen. Modern dive computers can change this so that you can select what gas mixture you're breathing on, and that shifts the entire algorithm and highlights some new features. Higher O2 mixes drops the amount of nitrogen in the gas that you breathe, which means that you can stay down for longer, which is great, right? But then you learn about oxygen's partial pressures and how too much oxygen can be dangerous at depth. If your PPO2 goes much higher than 1.6, then you're gonna have a bad day. So wouldn't it be nice if there was some kind of alarm for that? Well, your dive computer has you covered, and it will monitor your PPO2 and alert you if it gets too high or too low. Your last gas that you learn about will be helium, which dilutes both the nitrogen and the oxygen so that you can dive deeper, but by this stage you should be pretty savvy with how your dive computer works, and your PPO2 will be a number that you always check during a dive. Your dive computer is pretty much like a sat-nav that works on the y-axis. Instead of guiding you left and right, your dive computer, when you read it correctly, will tell you when it's safe to go in this direction and which way you should really go, and what the speed limit is as well, so that you don't ascend too fast. If you take a wrong turn, your sat-nav recalculates and then gets you back on track, and your dive computer will do the same. If you go over your NDL, then your computer just takes you down a different route that includes a stop at a given depth. It's always calculating your route and also potential routes to get you back home safely. Your dive computer will always have the surface as your destination, and its job is to get you there in the fastest and safest way possible, and it will shout at you if you take a wrong turn or you try to cut any corners. If you're diving with multiple gas mixes, then your computer may suggest a faster route for you if you just switch to this other mix, and it will tell you if a certain route is unsuitable for the mix that you're actually on. But you do need to know your dive computer so that you can input your gas mixes properly, and your dive computer knows which roads are available. Dive computers are very, very clever, and much like Excel and Photoshop, we only really use a fraction of their full potential. But because they have so much power inside and they are constantly working things out, it is so important that you understand your dive computer and what it's trying to tell you. You can't just Google the user manual underwater and watch a video on what to do, but how well do you know your dive computer? Have you ever looked at the user manual before, except to, control F and error message? Let's talk about dive computers down below in the comments. Thank you for watching, and safe diving. Then you will find a myriad of stories of divers who have died in caves, and at the mouths of most underwater caves you'll often see a sign with the Grim Reaper on it, encouraging divers to turn back now. But if caves are so dangerous, why do so many divers explore them? Let's take a look at why you should cave dive.